Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and I am excited to be here today to talk about vulnerability and how important it is to have that when you are trying to be a disruptive leader to create change. And I wanted to talk about this because I oftentimes hear from leaders that, well, I can't be vulnerable because I have to be strong. I have to show up as a leader. I mean, people are expecting me to be clear, to be strong, to be right, and not to have this uncertainty, this kind of doubt that I would show if I were truly to show up and be myself and be vulnerable. So that's what I want to talk about today. And in particular, I'd love for you to share again where you're coming from, but also share a time when you showed up as being vulnerable. What did you do? How did you actually show up and be vulnerable? And then what were some of the benefits of that? What were the reactions that you heard from people when you were doing that? So, what I'm going to be talking about today is this whole act of this contradiction about being strong and being that strong leader, but also being vulnerable. So I want to go into a little bit about what it is that we do to actually be vulnerable and why it is so hard to do. So let me get into my notes here. And one of the things that often comes up is I'm just trying to find my notes here. That contradiction. So the reasons why we try not to be vulnerable is that, well, we know we need to be strong, right? And also in particular, but the reality is that we aren't strong all the time. The reality is that we're actually are quite naturally vulnerable. We were born as these little babies, and as we're growing up, we're still learning so many different ways to become the person that we are today. And even today, we're still on a path of growth. And so the reality is that we are not perfect beings. We are vulnerable. We are imperfect. We are prone to make mistakes and to fail. And the sooner we're comfortable talking about these things, the more actually authentic we can be, not only to the people around us, but to ourselves as well. And the reality is that we put up this shell, this appearance, this disguise in some ways of being strong all the time, of being sure, of being perfect, being just so confident that we have all the answers. When in reality, we're none of those things all of the time. So, what happens as a result of this is that we don't get seen by other people as who we truly are. And as a result, we're not also accepted and included as that whole person, that richness of everything that we bring. So, what I believe vulnerability is actually an act of courage. It is actually a strength. And Mario says here, I just want to put up this comment because it's so good. Let me see if I can get it to go. Here we go. Agree. It all boils down to the value of authenticity. And thank you so much, Mario, for sharing that because when we are truly being authentic, what happens is people can see us and understand us. And more importantly, it allows people to form a deeper relationship with us. For those of you who have been watching my streams or are familiar with my work, I think it all boils down to relationships. And leadership is simply a relationship between people who are aspire to create change and those who are inspired to follow them. It's this deep, rich relationship. And what could be more meaningful than when you show up as your true, authentic self? You show all aspects of yourself, including the times when you're not sure, when you're feeling doubt, you're showing vulnerability and that authenticity that you are just like everyone else. And when you ask that of other people too, as well, they are truly showing up as themselves. They're bringing their whole selves to the table. Then that relationship all around gets better and stronger. So a couple other comments from people just want to share. Thank you again for sharing this. Brenda says, step back and interrupt the usual thinking pattern that has brought me success and instead curious about what is happening in relation to the person in front of me that is smart, creative, and resourceful. So thank you so much, Brenda, for sharing that moment of when you were vulnerable and what it brought to the table also for other people in them. Jay shares, imposter syndrome, which we're going to talk about in a second. As somebody who also goes through imposter syndrome, this is something that I think we all feel like, are we really getting paid to do this? Am I really getting away with this? Do I actually belong in this room? I mean, all those doubts that keep coming up for us, being able to talk about that, to say, no, I'm feeling this way. And it may seem strange that this highly accomplished person could be feeling so insecure or uncertain about a situation, but that's the reality. And the more we're genuine about it, the better we can be as people. So I finally, I'll just add this one other comment from Elizabeth. There's always a taboo to show the real self, but it's so important so people can relate to who the person is and will eventually get a deeper and more meaningful connection to them. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing those things. I think these are some of the benefits of vulnerability. We can connect with people at this much deeper level. It forces us to look at aspects of ourselves in ways that we may not be willing to on our own. It also encourages us to accept ourselves completely and fully as this rich, full person with strengths, but also flaws, and to be open to learning new ways to actually grow and learn and see ourselves in the world. And finally, I think what vulnerability does, and this is so important if you want to drive disruption to create that change, is that it gets us to feel comfortable with the uncomfortable. When you feel uncomfortable sitting in that vulnerability, it also reflects the times when you're taking on an audacious project or strategy. And you're out there at the very edge, and you say to yourself, I don't know what I'm doing here. I've prepared and everything, but at this point, it feels so uncertain. But you're familiar with that feeling. You know what it feels like to be uncertain, to be on that edge, to be vulnerable to whatever and open to whatever the outcome is. And I think that is the true strength that you gain from being vulnerable. You don't lose strength, you gain strength. And in particular, you gain the courage to sit in that uncomfortable space, to be able to be open to whatever comes your way from putting yourself in that position. So I want to talk a little bit more about just some of the things that also benefit an organization. If those were the benefits to you as a leader, as an individual, there are some significant benefits to vulnerability being brought into the organization. So imagine an organization, though, that didn't have any vulnerability, where everybody is completely sure of themselves. They're putting on this facade to say, like, yeah, I got it. I'm strong. I know what the answer is. Nothing's wrong. There's no doubt in my mind at all. You can imagine what kind of disastrous organization that would be. Nobody would admit that they weren't sure about something. Nobody would admit that something's going wrong because that would be showing weakness. And I see so many organizations doing this because they fundamentally do not trust the people around them to be generous, to be understanding, to be patient, to give them grace in those moments of opening up authentically and vulnerably. So if you want to raise your hand and say, hey, this project isn't going the way, I need help, is that seen as an act of courage and strength, or is it frowned upon? Because how could you say something's not going right? Just go and fix it. It's unacceptable to bring up the bad news. And that type of organization is going to be very fragile. It's not going to be putting its best foot forward because everyone's in their own little corners, hiding behind these facades and not truly talking about what's really going on. So I think about this as a vulnerability index of an organization. How eager and how willing and how intentionally are people looking for opportunities to be honest, to be authentic, to really put on the table what's really going on with them and with their teams? This, I think, is a true benefit of vulnerability, that in the end, we can talk about whatever we can, whatever we need to talk about. And our relationship is strong enough that it will be able to sustain it. We open ourselves up to not just that feedback, but we removing the fear and the shame of being ostracized, of being criticized, of being judged. And when we can set aside those fears and those limiting beliefs, then we can really grow together as an organization and as a team. So I just want to just share and see if there are any other comments here. We have ultimately Lehin. I'm going to get your name right at some point. Vulnerability will surely come because we are human. But how to remedy this situation and mitigate the effects with our character and competence matters most. Such great words because it's our natural place to be human, to be vulnerable, to be authentic, because we use that as a way to build the relationships. But what you're saying is that one of the biggest issues is how do we mitigate the downsides of that in an organization? I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And then Brenda also has this comment that she likes when I mention courage, because in uncertainty, there will always be fear. And how do you choose to have courage in being vulnerable? And even when you are vulnerable, you may be rejected. And there'll be surely soon an opportunity to try again. So Brenda, thank you for bringing up this incredibly difficult aspect of being vulnerable, because you're putting it all out there. You're laying it on the table and you're saying, here's me. Here's my situation. And you're trusting the people around you to take that, respect it, to be gentle, to be kind, and to deal with that with the grace that's needed in that situation, and to be supportive and encouraging. So this is incredibly difficult because, as Mario says, and agreeing with Brenda, it's so important to maintain a disposition of curiosity over being reactive, because that's where the power comes from. And so I want to talk in this last point about what you can do personally, and then also as an organization to encourage greater vulnerability, more vulnerability. So, and the hard part about this is that, again, it feels really risky. So, how do you actually do this? How do you actually go out there and be vulnerable? I just want to pull out a quote from one of my favorite thought leaders and researchers, Brene Brown, and her book, Rising Strong, that she has this saying that vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. And I want to just emphasize it's showing up and being seen, allowing yourself to be seen when you have no control over the outcome. That to me, if it does it for you, gives gives me stomach churns and it makes my palms sweaty thinking about those situations when you're just sitting out there, you're putting yourself out there, you're like, here I am, go for it. And you're opening yourself up potentially for that criticism and the judgment. So there are some things that you can do to prepare yourself to do this more if you're already doing it, or even doing it for the first time. If you're one of those leaders that's just going, I am not comfortable with this. And I have to say, if you're not comfortable, then that is exactly the right place for you to be. This is hard. This is hard for anybody to go out there and do. I find it incredibly difficult to do when I'm about to go talk to somebody where I want to give them feedback, or to say, look, what you just said made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. And I'll just give you an example. Again, as a woman, as an Asian American, as somebody of color, it's I come across so many situations where I feel uncomfortable in a situation. Somebody said something, made an offhand joke, and the question becomes, do I say something or not? Because putting myself into a situation, making me see myself feel very vulnerable. It's also drawing attention to the fact that I am different from other people. And over the past 5, 7 years or so, I have been much more willing to put that part of me on the table, to go out and say to somebody, I really value our relationship and I so enjoy working with you. And that comment you just made in that last meeting when you said this made me uncomfortable. And to strengthen our relationship, I really needed to tell you this. And I'm feeling very vulnerable about this right now. You can say all these things to be really putting yourself out there and to be truly seen for you as a person. But that's really hard. It's not our normal way of being because we've been trained our entire lives not to rock the boat, not to go out there and say these things that could put a wedge between us and somebody else. But what I found in almost every single one of those situations, it opened up the discussion, a deeper understanding, and deepened the relationship between me and that person. So this is incredibly difficult to do. So a couple things to do. Do, for example, a self-assessment of yourself. Take a look at times in the past week, in the past month, or at any time over the past year when you've stopped yourself short from truly expressing what you were thinking, feeling, or experiencing with other people. And think about what you could have done differently. Looking back with hindsight, what could you have said differently? How could you have shown up in a different way? And put yourself into that uncomfortable situation. Now, in the beginning, you may be thinking, like, well, let's not tackle the really big thing. So, my second thing is to say, look for small opportunities to build up your vulnerability muscle. This is, again, not something that you're going to instantaneously become really good at. So be kind to yourself. Look for opportunities to do this in small ways, to do this with people where you feel the relationship is really strong. And when you do that in those circumstances, you can take yourself to a deeper level in that relationship. I would encourage you to also practice with somebody, create an accountability partner with somebody who does this on a regular basis. There's no better way to become more vulnerable than to hang out with people who are already doing this. Tell them this is something you want to work on and encourage them to work with you on this to support you in those times when you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable going into that next step and have a sounding board. And then the last area of work that I have really found to be very helpful for me is the practicing of mindfulness. And this is the ability to focus on what's really going on in that moment around you rather than being disengaged or distracted from what's really going on. It's about being present. And you can have a practice of mindfulness through journaling, just writing out and working through whatever it is that's working you. You could be through meditation. So some people have a practice of meditating for a few minutes or taking deep breaths. And then some people even just do simple things like have a reminder of a timer that as you're working on something, they use something like a Pomodoro timer, a tomato timer, set it for 20 minutes, deep focus, and then reminder to step back, take a breath, take a moment to center yourself before diving back into it again. All of these things just become very useful tools to understand for you in the moment what's really going on with you. What's that emotion, how you're thinking, and to be more aware of that so that you can tap into that when the moment comes for you to say something, to be really clear on what's going on with you. So, the other thing I would say that as an organization, now, if you want to increase vulnerability as an organization, the best way to do this is to model it yourself, to model the way of how to be vulnerable. And this means talking about when you're feeling uncertain, expressing when you see something that's not going the way you thought it would be, and you want to ask questions about what that is. And it's about really talking about ways that you can build more of those connections with people. And in particular, I want to talk about opportunities to model the way up into the organization because I find there's a direct correlation with the higher a person is in the organization, with the less likely that they're going to feel comfortable being vulnerable because they have gotten to where they are because they have been right, that they have been strong. And the concern is that the higher up in the organization, if I show that things are not going as well, that I have doubts, that I'm not going to be 100% certain right, that could be seen as a weakness. And I've got to put up all this scaffolding and all this buttressing in order to maintain my position here. So here's a way to model vulnerability up into the organization. And that is to go to that leader and say, hey, I'm having this situation now, and share that you are feeling whatever it is, X, Y, and Z. And ask that leader for advice to say, can you help me with this? Can you tell me a time when you experienced the same thing? And what did you do about it? So it's not asking them to be vulnerable, it's really asking them to help you figure out something. And you do this by, again, taking that first step, appearing vulnerable, and saying, I need your help, your experience, your wisdom, your knowledge of how did you do with situations like this? And it's very, very unlikely if this person has a beating heart to say, for that person to say, I've never felt that. Sorry, can't help you with it. Again, if they're a leader worth their salt and they're up in this part of the organization, they're going to be like, well, yeah, I had a time when I did this. And this is a very important step. Thank them profusely for sharing, for opening up, for being authentic, for being vulnerable and sharing with you that time when they were going through a similar type of situation. When that leader sees that and sees a positive effect of them opening up and sharing in this way, it has a cumulative effect that says, hey, it's okay for me to share about things in this way. And therefore it begins that again, it opens up the possibility that they're going to do it more, and just keep at it. Really encourage the people around you to see what the benefits of vulnerability are. All right, so that's one last thing I do want to say about this, and that is, again, this is hard to do, and it can be stressful and create anxiety. And I encourage you to think about this in a different way. This is not about um, always being stressed about being vulnerable. This is about stretching your way into this new state of being comfortable with yourself, that you can have the confidence to show all of yourself to the people around you. And I think about this as stretching yourself out of your comfort zone while not stressing yourself. So, knowing the difference between stretching and stressing is such a key part to doing this work. And we as leaders need to be continually pushing ourselves out of that comfort zone to stretch ourselves to the very edges of where we're comfortable, but not to do it in a way that stresses us and the people around us in uncomfortable ways to the breaking point. So I just want to just see all these great comments that are coming up here. And again, ask your questions if you have any. Let's see, we have this other comment from Jay coming in. It's high risk, high gain. Most organizations want to control things. Disruption and change exposes and highlights vulnerability. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jay, because in the end, this is why disruption is so hard. It exposes all those cracks and places of, are we truly as strong as we think we are? Are we as together and united in our belief that this is the right strategy? Or are we rubber stamping it and hoping in the back of our minds that it doesn't actually work out so we don't have to go on this hard journey? And let's see, here's another comment from George. Do I really need to be strong, or is it enough to have courage? What do you think? Great question, George. I think it's so much better to have courage. I think that strength and being strong is a bit overrated because, yeah, sure, it's great to be strong, to be able to show up and like, put up the strong man approach, like I am powerful, right? Um, but what if you're not? What if the actuality is you have these weaknesses and you're not aware of them? What if the actuality is you think you're strong, but other people can see the flaws that you can't, and so they can exploit them in ways that you could never have imagined. So I think it's great to be strong, to be the strongest you can be, but I think it's even more important to have the courage to understand and to admit that you don't have all the answers, because that's when other people can come in and support you, and together with other people you're going to be so much stronger. But that takes courage to admit that you can't do this only on your own. So, Brenda, again, another great comment. The willingness to be vulnerable also opens up aliveness and new possibilities. I love this because if you think about vulnerability does, it doesn't make you weak. It actually helps you see the world in new and different ways. It creates possibility, curiosity, joy, and even love in our lives. Because if you look to our most sacred relationships in our lives, our family and our friends, we know that they are so much better because we are our true authentic selves. We are being vulnerable in front of them and don't have this need to be perfect around them all the time. And that's where the possibilities really become true. Let's see. Um, I have a question from Jay. Does it beg the assumption that the leader is the head of an organization? Great question. Leader is not necessarily the very top. It could be a leader anywhere in the organization. And when I say leaders have a hard time appearing vulnerable, it's up and down throughout the organization. And I find that the leaders who need this work the most are the ones who have just been promoted because they probably haven't had a lot of leadership development and training. They haven't had the scaffolding to say, this is how you show up as a leader. And now they're expected to have all the answers, and they don't. So, how will they show up? How can they tap into that vulnerability to establish a credibility as a leader? So, Brenda also says that building that vulnerability muscle, I'm glad you like that. That can have life changing results. That can be very exciting. And then Elizabeth has this interesting comment. Leaders are the reflection of what the soul of the organization is. I love that. It's so important to show the positive outlook and also the vulnerability so people can relate and take risks wholeheartedly. I love this, that leaders are the reflection of the soul of the organization. Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. And when the leaders can demonstrate and model vulnerability, then that also means that the organization is going to be so much better off because we're having those difficult conversations. We're actually saying what's really going on for ourselves and for the organization too. Let's see. And then Randy Randall had this one comment. Thank you so much for enjoying that online leadership course I have on the digital leader. And it really resonated with you, it sounds like, this whole idea of being human, listening to people and telling the story of what's really going on for you. So thank you so much for sharing all of these comments. I encourage you to take a look at some of the materials, maybe in some other streams about, for example, stretching and stressing, about how to be open. And I just want to encourage you to, again, look for those opportunities, do that assessment and say, when could I have spoken up? Where are the times when I could have challenged myself? And then prepare yourself for future encounters to say, I'm going into this meeting with this group of people that I really wanted to develop a strong relationship with, who I want to increase the vulnerability index of the organization. How can I proactively and intentionally create this greater sense of belonging and connection by showing up and being vulnerable? So I wish you all the best with that. And I want to just give you a heads up that our time together next week is going to be at a slightly different time. I have a few conflicts on Tuesday, so we're going to be moving the live stream to Wednesday, October 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific time and 1 o'clock Eastern time. And we'll be discussing the unsung heroes of disruption. So hang on and tune in next Wednesday to hear about some of those ideas I have about who are these heroes that we really want to respect and recognize and acknowledge for being such fantastic parts of the disruption journey. I wish you all the best and thank you again for joining. All the best to you in being vulnerable. Hope you practice and please always, I really love to hear your comments about what's working, what's not. So please share in the comments of this live stream how you're doing on this vulnerability edge of yourself. How are you pushing yourself to the very edge of being vulnerable? I would love to hear what's working, what's not, and your continued thoughts on this. All right, thank you so much, everyone, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.